October 17th, 2013. The kind of autumn evening in Manhattan that makes you believe in second chances. Golden light filtered through the canopy of Central Park, painting everything in warm amber hues that photographers dream about and parents treasure in their memory banks. The air carried that crisp bite that signals summer's final surrender, and families were making the most of what might be the last perfect evening before winter's grip tightened around the city. Detective Marcus Reed would remember that evening for the rest of his life, though not for the reasons anyone should remember an October dusk. He was 34 then, still young enough to believe that every missing child case would end with tearful reunions and happy news crews. Still naive enough to think that monsters wore masks and good guys always won. The Lucas Harper case would strip away those comfortable illusions one by one, leaving behind a man who understood that some darkness runs so deep it changes the very foundation of what you thought you knew about the world. Sarah Harper had planned everything perfectly. She always did. Organization was her superpower, the thing that kept her small family running like clockwork, even after her husband deployed overseas for the third time in 5 years. 7-year-old Lucas needed structure, needed predictability, especially with his father serving another tour that seemed to stretch endlessly into an uncertain future. So Sarah planned their Central Park afternoon with military precision. Playground time from 3 to 4, snacks and homework on the bench by the pond from 4 to 5, then a leisurely walk back to their Upper West Side apartment before darkness fell. Lucas was the kind of child who made strangers smile involuntarily. Freckles scattered across his nose like tiny constellations, hair that refused to stay combed, no matter how much gel Sarah applied, and an infectious laugh that could brighten the darkest subway car. He had his father's earnest brown eyes and his mother's stubborn streak, a combination that usually served him well but occasionally led to the kind of minor rebellion that 7-year-olds specialize in. That evening, his rebellion would change everything. The playground hummed with the familiar symphony of childhood. Swings creaked in rhythm, slides echoed with the thump of small feet, and parents clustered on benches with coffee cups and smartphones, one eye on their devices and one eye on their offspring. Sarah positioned herself strategically at a bench with clear sightlines to both the jungle gym where Lucas preferred to play and the path they would take home. She had learned to be vigilant without being obvious about it, a skill that single mothers in the city master early or regret forever. At 4:15, right on schedule, she called Lucas over for his snack. Apple slices and goldfish crackers, his current favorite combination. He bounded over with that particular 7-year-old energy that seems to defy the laws of physics, his shoelaces somehow already untied despite being double-knotted 20 minutes earlier. As he munched his apple and swung his legs from the bench, chattering about a new friend he had made on the monkey bars, Sarah felt that particular brand of contentment that comes from a day well planned and perfectly executed. But children have their own ideas about perfect days, and Lucas had spotted something that called to him more than homework time. A group of older kids were flying a kite near the Great Lawn, and the red and blue diamond dancing against the darkening sky was irresistible to a boy who had been cooped up in classrooms all week. When Sarah opened his math workbook and called his name, Lucas was already halfway across the grass, his small legs carrying him toward the kite flyers with single-minded determination. Sarah's first instinct was maternal frustration rather than fear. This was typical Lucas behavior. See something interesting, pursue it immediately, worry about consequences later. She gathered up the scattered goldfish crackers and his workbook, calling his name with that particular tone that parents use when their patience is being tested. The kite flyers were maybe 100 yards away, well within her sightline, and Lucas was a smart kid who knew to stay in open areas where she could see him. What happened next would replay in Sarah's mind like a broken film reel for years to come. She watched Lucas approach the older children, saw him stop and talk to someone she couldn't quite see from her angle. The kite continued its aerial dance, the older kids continued their play, and Lucas appeared to be engaged in what looked like a perfectly normal conversation with someone just outside her field of vision. Nothing seemed wrong, nothing looked dangerous. It was just her son being friendly, the way she had taught him to be. She packed up their belongings, taking her time because Lucas was clearly enjoying himself and they were in no particular hurry. The sun was still well above the tree line, and their evening routine could be flexible when her son was being social and happy. When she looked up again, ready to call him back for their walk home, The older kids were still there. The kite was still flying. But Lucas was gone. At first, Sarah felt only mild annoyance. He had probably wandered a bit further than she had realized, maybe following the kite flyers to a better spot. She called his name, louder this time, and began walking toward where she had last seen him. The older kids looked at her curiously when she approached, their kite temporarily forgotten, as this obviously distressed woman interrupted their game. None of them had seen Lucas. They had been focused on their kite, they explained, and hadn't noticed a younger boy approaching. Sarah's mild annoyance shifted to something sharper, something that tasted like copper in her mouth. She began calling Lucas's name in earnest now, her voice carrying across the open grass with increasing urgency. Other parents began to notice. The universal parent alarm system activated, that invisible network that connects every mother and father in a public space when one of their own is in distress. Soon there were a dozen adults combing the immediate area, calling Lucas's name, checking behind trees and under benches and in all the hiding spots that adventurous 7-year-olds might explore. By the time Detective Marcus Reed received the call, the search had expanded to include park security and the first responding officers. Sarah Harper stood in the center of a growing circle of concern, her careful composure finally beginning to crack as the reality of the situation settled around her like fog. Her son was not hiding. He was not playing an elaborate game. Lucas Harper had simply vanished. Reed arrived as the last natural light was fading from the sky, the artificial illumination of park lamps creating islands of visibility in the growing darkness. He had worked missing child cases before, and he knew the statistics that nobody ever shared with parents in those first crucial hours. He knew how quickly hope could turn to heartbreak, how completely a life could change in the space between one breath and the next. But Reed also knew that the first 24 hours were everything in cases like this, and he approached the scene with the kind of methodical intensity that had earned him his detective shield at 32. He interviewed Sarah Harper with gentle efficiency, documenting every detail of their afternoon, every person Lucas might have encountered, every deviation from their normal routine. The kite-flying teenagers were helpful, but had little useful information. They had been absorbed in their activity, and genuinely hadn't noticed Lucas approaching or talking to anyone. Park security provided footage from the nearest cameras, but the angles were wrong, and the distance too great to capture anything useful from the area where Lucas had disappeared. What they did find were footprints. Small sneaker impressions in the soft earth near where Sarah had last seen her son, leading away from the playground area and toward a less populated section of the park. Reed followed the trail with a growing sense of unease, using his flashlight to illuminate each small impression in the dirt. The footprints were clearly from children's sneakers, size consistent with what a 7-year-old would wear. They moved in a purposeful line, not the wandering pattern of a lost child, but the deliberate path of someone with a destination in mind. For about 50 yards, the trail was clear and easy to follow, leading deeper into the park's wooded areas where fewer families ventured, especially as darkness approached. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the footprints simply stopped. Reed crouched at the spot where the trail ended, shining his light in every direction, searching for some explanation. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions. There were no rocks or hard surfaces that would erase the trail, and yet Lucas Harper's footprints simply ceased to exist, as if he had been lifted into the air. Reed called for additional units, for crime scene techs, for every available resource. He had a feeling in his gut, the kind of instinct that good detectives learn to trust, that this was not a simple case of a wandering child. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond a boy getting lost in a park he knew well. As the search expanded into the night, with helicopters circling overhead and K-9 units combing the park's more remote areas, Reed stood at the spot where the footprints ended and tried to understand what he was seeing. In 15 years of police work, he had never encountered anything quite like this. Children didn't just vanish. There were always clues, always evidence, always something that pointed toward an explanation. The search continued through the night and into the following days. Volunteers joined professional searchers, covering every inch of Central Park and expanding into the surrounding neighborhoods. Lucas's photograph appeared on news broadcasts and missing child websites, his freckled face becoming familiar to millions of people who had never met him but hoped desperately for his safe return. Sarah Harper became the face of a mother's worst nightmare, appearing at press conferences with the hollow-eyed determination of someone operating purely on hope and caffeine. She answered the same questions repeatedly, described her son's clothing and temperament and habits to anyone who would listen, and refused to consider any possibility other than his safe return. But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, the harsh reality of the situation began to settle over everyone involved. The massive search effort gradually scaled back to routine patrols. The media attention shifted to newer tragedies and more current mysteries. The case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and false sightings, but no closer to any real answers. Reed worked the case with an intensity that concerned his colleagues and strained his personal relationships. He interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely, and spent his off-duty hours walking through Central Park, trying to understand what had happened to Lucas Harper. The boy's disappearance became a weight he carried, a constant reminder of his failure to bring answers to a devastated mother. 12 years passed. Sarah Harper eventually moved away from New York, unable to bear living in the same city where her son had vanished. The Lucas Harper case file moved from active to cold, joining thousands of other unsolved mysteries in the NYPD's archives. Reed was promoted to the district attorney's office, his obsession with justice serving him well in his new role as a prosecutor. Though colleagues noticed, he never quite lost the haunted look that had settled over him after that October evening in 2013. But some cases never truly go cold, no matter what the files say. Some mysteries burrow so deep into a man's soul that they change his very DNA, making him different from who he was before he encountered them. For Marcus Reed, the Lucas Harper case was more than an unsolved mystery. It was a living, breathing reminder that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning or explanation. What Reed didn't know, as he built his new career on the foundation of his old failures, was that Lucas Harper's disappearance was about to become relevant again. That somewhere in the city he thought he knew, evidence was waiting to be discovered that would turn everything he believed about that October evening completely upside down. October 17th, 2025. Exactly 12 years to the day since Lucas Harper vanished without a trace, and Marcus Reed couldn't escape the irony that seemed to follow him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He stood in his office on the 14th floor of the Manhattan District Attorney's building, looking out at a city that had changed dramatically since that autumn evening that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life. Reed was 46 now, his hair showing threads of silver that hadn't been there when he was chasing down leads in Central Park. The years had carved lines around his eyes, the kind that come from squinting at case files under fluorescent lights and staring too long at crime scene photographs that most people couldn't stomach. His colleagues knew him as a relentless prosecutor, someone who prepared for every case as if the fate of civilization hung in the balance. What they didn't know was that his intensity stemmed from a single failure that had never stopped haunting him. The transformation from detective to prosecutor hadn't been planned. After 3 years of working the Lucas Harper case with no progress, Reed had found himself questioning everything about police work. The bureaucracy, the resource limitations, the way cases could be shuffled aside when newer tragedies demanded attention. He had watched Sarah Harper's hope slowly die, had seen her transform from a vibrant mother into a hollow-eyed woman who jumped every time her phone rang, always expecting news that never came. Law school had been Reed's way of approaching justice from a different angle. If he couldn't solve every case as a detective, maybe he could ensure that the cases that did get solved resulted in real consequences for the perpetrators. The transition had been brutal. Night classes while working full-time, studying constitutional law when he should have been sleeping, trading his detective's instincts for legal precedents and courtroom strategy. But Reed had excelled at prosecution the way some people excel at breathing. His police background gave him credibility with juries, and his obsessive attention to detail meant that defense attorneys rarely found holes in his cases. More importantly, his experience with unsolved mysteries had taught him to look for patterns where others saw only chaos, to find connections that more traditional prosecutors might miss. The Lucas Harper case file sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, unofficial but never forgotten. Reed had made copies of everything before transitioning out of the police department, unable to let go of the case that had defined his career as a detective. Once a month, usually late at night when the building was empty and his thoughts turned to old failures, he would spread the photographs and witness statements across his desk and try to see something he had missed. 12 years of technological advancement had brought new possibilities to cold cases. DNA testing that had been cutting edge in 2013 was now routine. Facial recognition software could scan thousands of hours of security footage in minutes. Digital forensics could extract information from devices that had seemed permanently corrupted. Reed had quietly used his position to ensure that Lucas Harper's case received periodic review with whatever new tools became available. But technology could only do so much when the original evidence was so limited. A few footprints that led nowhere. Security footage that showed nothing useful. Witness statements from children who had been focused on flying kites rather than observing their surroundings. After 12 years, the case remained as baffling as it had been on that first night when Reed had stood in Central Park, trying to understand how a 7-year-old boy could simply vanish into thin air. Sarah Harper had moved to Portland 6 years earlier, finally accepting that New York held too many painful memories. She had remarried, a patient man who understood that part of her heart would always belong to a missing child. Reed received Christmas cards from her new family, always signed with hope that this would be the year they finally got answers. He had never told her about his monthly reviews of the case file, didn't want to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. The anniversary date had a way of making Reed restless, as if his subconscious kept a calendar that his rational mind tried to ignore. For the past few years, he had developed a ritual of sorts. On October 17th, after finishing his work at the DA's office, he would drive to Central Park and walk the route that Lucas Harper had taken on his last known day alive. It wasn't official police business, wasn't productive in any measurable way, but it was something Reed needed to do. This year felt different, though Reed couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the fact that 12 years seemed like such a significant milestone, or maybe it was the 3 cases he had prosecuted that month involving child endangerment. The courtroom victories should have felt satisfying, but instead they reminded him of the one case where justice had never been served, where a little boy's disappearance remained an open wound in the fabric of his professional life. The evening air carried the same crisp bite that Reed remembered from 2013, autumn asserting itself with the kind of weather that made New Yorkers remember why they loved their city, despite everything it put them through. Central Park looked different in some ways. New playground equipment, updated lighting, additional security cameras that hadn't existed when Lucas disappeared. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged, the same blend of natural beauty and urban energy that drew millions of visitors every year. Reed parked near the same entrance that Sarah Harper had used that October evening 12 years earlier. He had memorized every detail of their routine, could walk their exact path with his eyes closed. Playground first, then the bench by the pond, then the fatal deviation toward the kite flyers that had changed everything. The psychological geography of that day was as familiar to him as his own apartment. As he walked, Reed found himself cataloging the differences between then and now. More homeless individuals had taken up residence in the park's more secluded areas, a reflection of the city's ongoing struggles with affordable housing and mental health services. The police presence was more visible, but also more routine, officers who patrolled regular beats rather than responding to specific incidents. The playground where Lucas had spent his last carefree hour buzzed with evening activity. Parents were more vigilant now, Reed noticed, phones put away in favor of direct supervision. The helicopter parenting that had been emerging in 2013 had become standard practice by 2025, driven by awareness of threats that previous generations had never needed to consider. Reed approached the area where Lucas had last been seen, where the footprints had begun their mysterious journey into the park's wooded sections. The landscape had changed somewhat. Trees had grown, pathways had been modified, and the specific spot where the trail had ended was now partially obscured by new vegetation. But Reed's memory filled in the details that time had erased, placing him back in that night 12 years ago, when he had first realized he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. He wasn't sure what he expected to find during these anniversary walks. The crime scene had been processed thoroughly multiple times, and 12 years of weather had long since eliminated any physical evidence that might have been missed initially. But something drew him back year after year, a combination of professional obligation and personal guilt that kept the case alive in his mind, even when logic suggested it should be filed away with other unsolvable mysteries. The shadows were lengthening as Reed moved deeper into the park, following the path that Lucas's footprints had taken before vanishing. The area was less populated now than it had been during the day, though joggers and dog walkers still moved along the main pathways. Reed had learned to blend in during these walks, to appear like any other visitor enjoying an evening stroll, rather than a prosecutor obsessively revisiting an old case. Near the spot where the footprints had ended, Reed noticed something that hadn't been there during his previous visits. Construction barriers marked an area where park maintenance had been working, signs indicating underground utility repairs that had required excavation. The work appeared to be recent, with fresh dirt piled nearby and equipment staged for what looked like an ongoing project. Reed's prosecutor instincts kicked in automatically, the part of his brain that had been trained to notice details that others might overlook. Construction work meant disturbed ground, which meant the possibility of uncovering things that had been buried for years. It was a long shot, and Reed knew he was probably grasping at straws, but something about the timing felt significant. The work site was secured with temporary fencing, but Reed could see that the excavation was deeper than typical utility work would require. Someone had been digging with serious intent, the kind of systematic excavation that suggested they were looking for something specific rather than just repairing pipes. The fresh earth was darker than the surrounding soil, rich with the scent of decomposition that could mean organic matter had been disturbed. Reed approached the fence cautiously, not wanting to draw attention, but unable to resist a closer look. His years as a detective had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this scene felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately identify. The excavation was too precise, too carefully executed for routine maintenance work. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in this particular spot. That's when he saw the corner of something black protruding from the pile of excavated dirt. At first glance, it looked like a piece of construction debris, maybe a tarp or plastic sheeting that had been disturbed during the digging. But as Reed moved closer, his trained eye picked up details that made his pulse quicken. The material was too uniform, too deliberately shaped to be random debris. Reed checked his surroundings to ensure he was alone, then carefully approached the object. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about the Lucas Harper case. Partially buried in the fresh dirt was a black garbage bag, but not the kind of ordinary trash bag that maintenance crews used for cleanup. This bag was heavy-duty, industrial grade, and it had been sealed with what appeared to be official police evidence tape. But that wasn't what made Reed's blood run cold. What stopped him in his tracks was the symbol carved into the plastic surface of the bag, etched with deliberate precision into the material. It was nothing Reed recognized from his years in law enforcement, nothing that appeared in any gang database or criminal classification system he knew. The symbol looked almost ritualistic, the kind of mark that suggested purpose and planning, rather than random vandalism. Reed reached for his phone, then stopped. Protocol demanded that he call this in immediately, report the discovery to the appropriate authorities, and let the system handle what might be evidence in an ongoing case. But Reed's experience had taught him that evidence had a way of disappearing when too many people became involved too quickly, especially evidence connected to cases that had been officially closed. Instead, he took photographs from multiple angles, documenting the bag's position and the surrounding area before anyone else could interfere. The evidence tape appeared fresh, not weathered in the way it would be if the bag had been buried for 12 years. Someone had sealed this bag recently, which meant that whatever was inside had been preserved intentionally by someone who understood evidence handling procedures. As Reed studied the bag more carefully, he noticed dark stains along its edges, stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Fresh blood, not the brown discoloration that would result from 12 years of burial. This bag hadn't been underground since Lucas Harper disappeared. Someone had buried it recently, and they had done so in the exact location where a 7-year-old boy's footprints had mysteriously vanished over a decade earlier. Reed felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had sustained him through his detective years, the electric realization that a cold case was about to become very hot indeed. But underneath the excitement was something darker, a growing certainty that whoever had placed this bag in this specific location knew exactly what they were doing. They knew about Lucas Harper, they knew about the investigation, and they knew that Marcus Reed would eventually find what they had left for him to discover. The question was no longer what had happened to Lucas Harper 12 years ago. The question was what someone wanted Reed to find now, and why they had chosen this particular moment to make sure he found it. Reed stared at the bag for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. 12 years of investigative experience had taught him to approach evidence methodically, to document everything before drawing conclusions. But 12 years of obsession with the Lucas Harper case had also taught him that normal protocols didn't always apply when dealing with mysteries that defied conventional explanation. The construction site was deserted, the work crew having finished for the day and secured their equipment behind the temporary fencing. Reed checked his watch, 7:43 in the evening, well past the time when park maintenance would have any legitimate reason to be in this area. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him privacy to examine the bag without interference, but it also meant he was completely alone with whatever secrets it contained. Reed's prosecutor training warred with his detective instincts. The lawyer in him knew that tampering with potential evidence could compromise any future case, make whatever was inside inadmissible in court. But the detective in him understood that evidence had a way of disappearing when it threatened the wrong people, and something about this entire situation screamed of cover-up and conspiracy. The bag itself was approximately 2 feet long and 8 inches wide, sealed at the top with what appeared to be authentic NYPD evidence tape. Reed had handled enough evidence bags during his detective years to recognize the real thing, and this tape looked genuine down to the serial numbers and department logos. Someone with access to official police supplies had sealed this bag, someone who knew proper evidence handling procedures, but the symbol carved into the plastic surface was unlike anything Reed had ever encountered in his law enforcement career. It appeared to be circular, with geometric patterns radiating from a central point like a twisted version of a compass rose. The lines were precise, etched with something sharp enough to cut through the heavy plastic without tearing it. Whoever had made this mark had taken their time, working with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggested ritual significance. Reed photographed the symbol from multiple angles, using his phone's flash to capture details that might be lost in the park's dim lighting. The mark appeared fresh, not weathered by exposure to the elements. This bag hadn't been buried for 12 years waiting to be discovered. Someone had placed it here recently, probably within the last few days or weeks. The timing bothered Reed more than he wanted to admit. The anniversary of Lucas Harper's disappearance was tomorrow, and someone had ensured that this bag would be discovered just before that date. The construction work that had unearthed it was legitimate. Reed could verify that through city records, but the bag's placement suggested that someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal whatever secrets it contained. Reed's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, reminding him about an early morning meeting with the district attorney. Normal life continued around him, the routine of prosecutorial duties and administrative responsibilities that had consumed his days for the past 8 years. But standing here in the gathering darkness, staring at evidence that might finally crack the case that had defined his career, Reed felt the old detective hunger stirring in his chest. He made a decision that would have horrified his law school professors and violated a dozen evidence-handling protocols. Instead of calling in the discovery, Reed carefully lifted the bag from its resting place in the excavated dirt. It was heavier than he had expected, the weight suggesting solid contents rather than documents or clothing. Whatever was inside had substance, density, the kind of weight that made his stomach clench with anticipation and dread. The bag had been sealed not just with evidence tape, but with what appeared to be plastic welding, the kind of professional sealing that required specialized equipment. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that whatever was inside remained preserved and protected. This wasn't the work of an amateur or an opportunistic criminal. This was the work of someone with resources, knowledge, and access to professional-grade materials. Reed carried the bag to a more secluded area of the park, away from the construction site and the walking paths where late evening joggers might pass. He needed privacy for what he was about to do, space to examine the contents without the risk of interruption. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, muscle memory from years of crime scene work taking over when his conscious mind threatened to overthink the situation. The evidence tape came away cleanly, as if it had been applied recently rather than years ago. Underneath, the plastic welding proved more challenging, requiring careful work with his pocket knife to avoid damaging whatever was inside. Reed worked slowly, methodically, documenting each step with photographs that might prove crucial if this evidence ever made it to court. When the seal finally gave way, Reed caught a scent that made his detective instincts scream warnings. It was the metallic smell of old blood, mixed with something else that his years of crime scene experience couldn't immediately identify. The combination was nauseating and familiar at the same time, the kind of smell that attached itself to crime scene investigators and followed them home despite multiple showers and changes of clothing. Inside the bag, Reed found 3 items that made him question everything he thought he knew about the Lucas Harper case. The first was a child's sneaker, small and worn, exactly the kind that a 7-year-old boy might wear. The shoe was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, dark brown patches that had soaked into the fabric and hardened over time. But what made Reed's blood run cold was the familiarity of the sneaker. He had memorized every detail of Lucas Harper's appearance from that October day 12 years ago, including the specific brand and style of shoes the boy had been wearing. This sneaker matched those details perfectly, down to the scuff marks on the toe and the way the laces had been tied in double knots. The second item was a digital camera, the kind of compact device that had been popular in the early 2000s, but had since been largely replaced by smartphones. The camera appeared to be functional despite its age, though Reed couldn't tell without powering it on whether any images remained stored in its memory. Someone had wrapped it carefully in plastic before placing it in the bag, preserving it with the same attention to detail that characterized the entire package. The third item made Reed's hands shake as he lifted it from the bag. It was a handwritten note, penned in careful block letters on what appeared to be official NYPD letterhead. The paper looked fresh, not aged in the way it should if it had been written 12 years ago. Someone with access to official police stationery had composed this note recently, and its contents made Reed realize that the Lucas Harper case was far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The note was brief, but chilling in its implications. It read, "Detective Reed, you were closer to the truth than anyone realized. The boy's disappearance was necessary to protect something much larger than one family's tragedy. Some secrets are worth more than justice. Some people have too much to lose to let the truth emerge. You have 48 hours to decide whether you want to join those who understand the real situation or whether you prefer to share Lucas Harper's fate. The camera contains proof of what really happened, but accessing that proof will change your life forever. Choose wisely." Reed read the note 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was seeing. Someone had been watching him for 12 years, monitoring his investigation. Aware of his continued interest in the case, they knew his name, knew his reputation, and apparently knew things about Lucas Harper's disappearance that had never been part of the official investigation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable: join the conspiracy or suffer the consequences. The note implied that Lucas Harper hadn't simply been kidnapped by a random predator, but had been silenced to protect some larger secret. And now, Reed was being offered the same choice: become complicit in the cover-up, or risk becoming another victim of whatever forces had claimed a 7-year-old boy. Reed's prosecutor mind automatically began analyzing the note for clues about its author. The handwriting was deliberately obscured, printed in block letters that would be impossible to match to a specific individual. The paper was genuine NYPD letterhead, which meant the author had access to official police supplies. Most disturbing of all, the note demonstrated detailed knowledge of Reed's investigation, suggesting that someone within the police department or district attorney's office had been feeding information to whoever was responsible for Lucas Harper's disappearance. The camera represented the biggest mystery and the greatest potential breakthrough. If it truly contained evidence of what had happened to Lucas Harper, it could finally provide the answers that had eluded Reed for 12 years. But the note's warning about accessing that proof suggested that some knowledge came with a price that might be too high to pay. Reed carefully repacked the items in the bag, his mind racing through his options. He could turn everything over to internal affairs and let them handle the investigation, but the note suggested that the conspiracy included people within the police department. He could take the evidence to the FBI, claiming federal jurisdiction, but 12 years of dead ends had taught him to be skeptical of institutional solutions to personal obsessions. Or he could do what every instinct in his body was telling him to do: examine the camera's contents himself, and finally learn the truth about what had happened to Lucas Harper. regardless of the consequences. As Reed secured the bag and prepared to leave the park, he noticed something that made his blood run even colder. Near the construction site, partially hidden behind a tree, a figure stood watching him. The person was too far away to identify, silhouetted against the park's artificial lighting, but their posture suggested patient observation rather than casual interest. Reed had been under surveillance, probably for the entire time he had been examining the bag. Someone had wanted him to find this evidence, and they had been watching to ensure that he did exactly what they expected him to do. The discovery wasn't accidental or lucky. It was orchestrated by people who understood Reed's psychology well enough to predict his actions. The figure moved away as soon as Reed noticed them, disappearing into the park's shadows with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to avoid detection. But their presence confirmed what the note had already suggested. Reed was no longer investigating the Lucas Harper case from a position of safety and anonymity. He had become a player in a game whose rules he didn't understand, with stakes that apparently included his own survival. Walking back to his car, Reed felt the weight of the bag in his hands and the even heavier weight of the decision he would have to make. 12 years of seeking justice for Lucas Harper had led him to this moment, where the truth was finally within reach, but came with a price that might destroy everything he had built since that October night, when a little boy vanished without a trace. The camera held answers, but Reed was beginning to understand that some answers were more dangerous than the questions they resolved. Reed drove through Manhattan's evening traffic, with the bag secured in his trunk, his mind cycling through possibilities and implications that grew more disturbing with each mile. The familiar streets of his city looked different now, as if the discovery in Central Park had shifted the entire landscape into something more sinister and uncertain. Every car that followed the same route for more than a few blocks seemed suspicious. Every pedestrian who glanced in his direction might be part of the surveillance network that had apparently been watching him for years. His apartment building on the Upper East Side had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where the weight of prosecutorial responsibilities could be set aside in favor of the simple routines of civilian life. But as Reed parked in the underground garage, he found himself checking the shadows between concrete pillars and noting the positions of security cameras that he had never paid attention to before. Paranoia was a luxury he couldn't afford, but caution had become a necessity in the space of a few hours. The elevator ride to his 14th-floor apartment gave Reed time to consider his options, though none of them seemed particularly appealing. He could follow the note's implicit suggestion and simply walk away from the Lucas Harper case, file the bag as anonymous evidence, and let someone else deal with its implications. 12 years of professional advancement had given him a comfortable life and a respected position. Risking all of that for a cold case might be the definition of foolishness, but Reed knew himself well enough to understand that walking away wasn't really an option. The Lucas Harper case had shaped him in ways that went beyond professional obligation, had become part of his identity in the same way that scars become part of the body that bears them. Sarah Harper's hollow-eyed hope, Lucas's freckled face smiling from missing child posters, the inexplicable trail of footprints that simply vanished. These images had haunted Reed's dreams for 12 years and wouldn't be dismissed by rational calculation of personal risk. Reed's apartment reflected the careful order of someone who used routine to maintain control over an unpredictable profession. Law books lined shelves that also held detective novels and true crime memoirs, the reading material of a man who had never quite decided whether he preferred fiction or reality when it came to matters of justice. The walls displayed framed certificates from his law school graduation and commendations from his prosecutor career, but notably absent were any personal photographs or mementos that might provide leverage to someone looking for pressure points. Reed placed the bag on his dining room table and stared at it for several minutes, trying to prepare himself mentally for whatever he was about to discover. The camera inside might contain nothing more than old vacation photos or mundane family moments, or it might contain evidence of a crime so significant that powerful people had spent 12 years ensuring it remained hidden. The only way to find out was to power up the device and see what secrets it had been preserving. Before examining the camera, Reed took precautions that his prosecutor training had taught him were essential when dealing with potentially explosive evidence. He photographed the bag and its contents from multiple angles, creating a digital record that could be uploaded to cloud storage and transmitted to trusted contacts if necessary. He drafted an email to a former colleague in internal affairs, detailing the discovery and his concerns about the note's implications, but saved it as a draft rather than sending it immediately. Reed also activated the recording function on his phone, creating an audio log of his actions and observations. If something happened to him in the next 48 hours, he wanted there to be a record of what he had found and why he had chosen to investigate it personally rather than following official channels. The paranoia felt excessive even as he implemented these precautions, but the note's tone had convinced him that excessive caution was preferable to naive trust in systems that might be compromised. The camera was a Canon PowerShot from the early 2000s, the kind of compact digital device that had been popular before smartphones made dedicated cameras largely obsolete. Reed had seen similar models in evidence lockers during his detective years, usually recovered from crime scenes or seized during searches. The device looked functional despite its age, though the battery indicator showed it was completely drained. Reed located a universal charger that was compatible with the camera's power requirements and plugged it in, watching as the device slowly came to life. The startup screen displayed a date that made Reed's pulse quicken: October 15, 2013, just 2 days before Lucas Harper's disappearance. Someone had been using this camera during the exact time period when the boy vanished, and they had preserved it carefully enough to ensure the images would still be accessible 12 years later. As the camera finished its startup sequence, Reed noticed that it contained a substantial amount of stored data. The memory card was nearly full, suggesting hundreds of photographs or possibly video files. Someone had used this device extensively during whatever events it had been intended to document, and they had considered that documentation important enough to preserve as evidence for over a decade. Reed's hands trembled slightly as he navigated the camera's menu system, muscle memory from his crime scene photography experience helping him access the stored files efficiently. The first few images appeared to be test shots, blank walls, lighting adjustments, the kind of preparatory work that someone might do before documenting something important. But as Reed scrolled through the chronological sequence, the images began telling a story that made his blood run cold. The photographs showed Central Park from angles that Reed recognized from his 12 years of investigating Lucas Harper's disappearance. Someone had been conducting surveillance of the park in the days leading up to the boy's vanishing, documenting sightlines, escape routes, and the positioning of security cameras. The level of detail was extraordinary, the work of someone who understood both photography and tactical planning. But what made Reed's stomach clench was the realization that these weren't random surveillance photos. The images showed specific focus on the playground where Lucas had spent his last afternoon, the path his family had taken during their routine visits, and the wooded area where his footprints had mysteriously ended. Someone had been planning Lucas Harper's disappearance with the kind of methodical preparation that suggested professional expertise and significant resources. Reed continued scrolling through the images, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that was becoming more complex and frightening than he had ever imagined. The photographs showed not just locations, but people: park security guards captured in candid shots, families with children documented from long distances, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be surveillance photos of Sarah Harper and Lucas during their previous visits to the park. The bastards had been watching the Harper family for weeks, possibly months before making their move. Lucas's disappearance hadn't been a crime of opportunity or a random predator striking at an unlucky moment. It had been a carefully planned operation executed by people with the resources and expertise to ensure they wouldn't be caught. As Reed reached the images from October 17th itself, he found himself looking at photographs that no one outside the investigation should have possessed. The camera had captured Lucas playing on the playground, Sarah reading on her bench, and the approach of the kite-flying teenagers who had provided Lucas with the distraction that led to his disappearance. Someone had been watching and documenting the entire sequence of events as they unfolded. But the most chilling images came from after Lucas had approached the kite flyers. Reed found himself looking at photographs of his own crime scene investigation, taken from concealed positions that would have required considerable skill to achieve without detection. The photographer had documented Reed examining the footprints, searching the wooded area, and standing at the exact spot where the trail had mysteriously ended. Reed realized with growing horror that the investigation itself had been under surveillance from the very beginning. Someone had been watching him investigate Lucas Harper's disappearance, documenting his methods and progress, probably reporting back to whoever had orchestrated the boy's vanishing. His 12 years of obsessive investigation hadn't been conducted in the privacy he had assumed. It had been observed and analyzed by the very people he was trying to catch. The final series of images made Reed question everything he thought he understood about law enforcement and justice. The photographs showed what appeared to be official police vehicles and personnel, but not in the context of the investigation. These images had been taken from inside one of the vehicles, showing the interior of what looked like a command center with communication equipment and surveillance monitors. Reed recognized some of the faces in these photos, though it took him several minutes to place them in his memory. They were senior officials from the NYPD, people who had been involved in the Lucas Harper investigation at the administrative level, but in these images they weren't conducting a search for a missing child. They were coordinating something else entirely, something that required the kind of communication security and operational planning associated with classified law enforcement activities. The camera's final image was a close-up of a document that made Reed's world tilt on its axis. It was an official memo on NYPD letterhead, dated October 18, 2013, one day after Lucas Harper's disappearance. The memo was classified and bore the signature of the police commissioner himself. Its contents were brief but devastating in their implications. The document ordered the immediate cessation of all search activities for Lucas Harper, citing national security concerns and federal jurisdiction. It directed that all evidence be transferred to an unnamed federal agency and that all officers involved in the investigation sign non-disclosure agreements. Most shocking of all, it explicitly stated that Lucas Harper's disappearance was considered a successful completion of an authorized operation rather than a criminal act requiring investigation. Reed read the memo 3 times, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Lucas Harper hadn't been kidnapped by a stranger or killed by a random predator. He had been taken as part of an official government operation with the knowledge and approval of the highest levels of the NYPD. The 12 years Reed had spent seeking justice for a missing child had been a cruel joke, a search for answers that had been deliberately hidden by the very institution he had served. But why would the government want to disappear a 7-year-old boy? What could Lucas Harper have known or represented that would justify such an extreme action? And why was someone now revealing this information to Reed 12 years after the fact? Reed's phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. The message was brief but terrifying in its implications. "You've seen the photos. Now you understand why some secrets must be kept. You have 36 hours to decide whether you want to continue down this path. Choose carefully. Not everyone who learns the truth gets the opportunity to walk away." Reed realized that his examination of the camera had been monitored in real time, probably through surveillance equipment in his own apartment that he had never detected. The people responsible for Lucas Harper's disappearance weren't just watching him. They were inside his most private spaces, observing his every move and reaction. Standing in his apartment that no longer felt safe, holding evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement, Reed understood that his life had fundamentally changed in the space of a few hours. The truth about Lucas Harper was finally within his grasp, but that truth came with a price that might include his own disappearance. The boy in the photograph smiled from frozen moments of innocence, unaware that his fate had already been sealed by forces beyond anyone's comprehension. Reed stared at those images and realized that justice for Lucas Harper might require a sacrifice that no one should have to make. Reed spent the night staring at the camera and its devastating revelations, his apartment transformed from sanctuary into prison cell by the knowledge that everything he believed about his career had been built on carefully constructed lies. Sleep was impossible when every creak of the building's settling structure could signal the approach of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to make inconvenient individuals disappear. The 36-hour deadline ticked away in his mind like a bomb's countdown timer, each passing hour bringing him closer to a decision that would define the rest of his life. By dawn, Reed had made his choice, though it felt less like a decision than a surrender to forces that had been shaping his destiny since that October evening 12 years ago. He couldn't walk away from Lucas Harper's case, not when he finally understood that the boy's disappearance was part of something larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The truth was a burden that Reed had been carrying unknowingly for over a decade, and now that burden had become his responsibility to bear fully. Reed's first stop was a secure storage facility in Queens, the kind of anonymous concrete building where people kept possessions they didn't want connected to their primary residences. He had rented the unit years earlier as a backup plan for sensitive case materials, though he had never imagined needing it for evidence that implicated his own colleagues in a government conspiracy. The camera and its contents went into a fireproof safe, along with copies of all the photographs and detailed notes about his investigation. The storage facility's security protocols included biometric access controls and motion-activated recording systems that would create a comprehensive record of anyone attempting to access Reed's unit. If something happened to him in the coming hours, the evidence would remain secure until someone with the proper authorization could retrieve it. Reed also programmed a dead man's switch into his phone, an application that would automatically send his documentation to several news outlets and federal agencies if he failed to check in within specified time intervals. Reed's second stop was the office of Elena Vasquez, an investigative journalist who had built her reputation on exposing corruption within law enforcement agencies. Vasquez worked for a small but influential publication that specialized in the kind of stories that larger news organizations often avoided due to political pressure or advertising concerns. Reed had prosecuted several cases that Vasquez had covered, developing a professional relationship built on mutual respect for each other's dedication to uncovering truth, regardless of personal cost. Vasquez's office occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, a deliberately unglamorous location that reflected her publication's commitment to substance over style. Reed found her exactly where he expected, hunched over a laptop surrounded by stacks of documents and empty coffee cups, pursuing some story with the single-minded intensity that had made her one of the most feared investigative reporters in the city. Reed presented Vasquez with a carefully edited version of his discovery, providing enough information to establish credibility without revealing details that could compromise his investigation or endanger her safety. He explained that he had uncovered evidence of a government conspiracy involving the disappearance of a child, but that pursuing the story would require resources and legal protections that he couldn't access through official channels. Vasquez listened with the practiced skepticism of someone who had heard countless conspiracy theories from sources of varying reliability, but her expression changed as Reed showed her selected photographs from the camera, images that demonstrated a level of planning and official involvement that couldn't be dismissed as paranoid speculation. When Reed showed her the classified memo ordering the cessation of the Lucas Harper investigation, Vasquez's journalistic instincts recognized a story that could fundamentally alter public understanding of government accountability. They agreed on a protocol that would protect both of them while ensuring the story could eventually be told. Vasquez would begin preliminary research into the government officials shown in the photographs, using her network of sources to verify their identities and positions. Reed would continue his investigation, but would check in with Vasquez at regular intervals, providing updates and additional evidence as it became available. Most importantly, they established a fail-safe system that would trigger automatic publication if Reed disappeared or was silenced before the investigation could be completed. Vasquez had dealt with dangerous stories before and understood the precautions necessary when powerful people had strong incentives to suppress inconvenient truths. Reed's third stop took him back to Central Park, but this time he wasn't following memories of a missing child or retracing the steps of a failed investigation. The photographs from the camera had revealed details about the park's layout and security systems that suggested whoever had planned Lucas Harper's disappearance possessed inside knowledge of law enforcement protocols and surveillance capabilities. Reed focused his attention on the areas that had been photographed most extensively, looking for clues about how the operation had been executed and where Lucas might have been taken after his footprints mysteriously ended. The images suggested that the wooded area where the trail disappeared had been chosen specifically because it offered multiple escape routes while remaining outside the coverage of the park's security camera network. What Reed found during his systematic examination of the area made him realize that the conspiracy was even more sophisticated than the camera's images had suggested. Hidden beneath a carefully camouflaged maintenance cover, Reed discovered what appeared to be an access point to the city's tunnel system, a network of utility conduits and abandoned infrastructure that connected Central Park to dozens of locations throughout Manhattan. The access point showed signs of recent use, despite being officially sealed for years. Someone with the proper tools and knowledge had been using this tunnel entrance to move through the city without detection, probably for purposes that went far beyond the Lucas Harper case. Reed realized he was looking at evidence of an ongoing operation that had been using New York's forgotten infrastructure to conduct activities that required complete anonymity. Reed's exploration of the tunnel system was limited by safety concerns and the knowledge that he was probably being watched, but what he could access revealed a level of preparation that suggested institutional support rather than freelance criminal activity. The tunnels had been modified with communication equipment, emergency supplies and navigational aids that indicated regular use by people who understood operational security and had access to professional-grade resources. More disturbing was Reed's discovery of what appeared to be a temporary holding area deep within the tunnel network, a chamber that had been equipped with basic life support systems and security measures. The space was empty now and showed no signs of recent occupation, but its existence suggested that Lucas Harper might not have been the only person who had been temporarily held in this underground facility. Reed's phone buzzed with another message from his unknown contact, the timing suggesting that his movements were being monitored in real time. The message was longer this time, more detailed in its explanation of the situation Reed had stumbled into through his obsessive investigation of a case that was supposed to remain closed forever. The text read, "Mr. Reed, your dedication to justice is admirable, but misguided. Lucas Harper's disappearance was necessary to prevent a much larger tragedy. The boy had been exposed to classified information during his father's military service, information that could have compromised ongoing national security operations if it fell into the wrong hands. His removal was authorized at the highest levels of government and executed by professionals who understood the stakes involved. The boy is alive and safe, living under a new identity in a location where he can never be found or used against his country's interests. Your investigation threatens not only your own safety, but the security of operations that protect millions of innocent people. You have 18 hours to cease your investigation and destroy all evidence you have gathered. Compliance will be rewarded with a position in the federal prosecutor's office and a substantial increase in salary. Continued resistance will result in consequences that you will not survive." Reed read the message several times, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was being told. If the text was truthful, Lucas Harper was alive, but living under circumstances that amounted to permanent imprisonment for a crime he couldn't possibly have committed. A 7-year-old boy had been kidnapped by his own government and given a new identity to prevent him from revealing classified information he probably didn't even understand. But Reed's prosecutor experience had taught him to be skeptical of explanations that seemed too convenient or self-serving. The national security justification was exactly the kind of rationale that government agencies used when their actions couldn't be defended through normal legal channels. Even if Lucas Harper had somehow been exposed to classified information, kidnapping a child was hardly a proportionate response to a potential security breach. More importantly, Reed realized that accepting the explanation would mean abandoning any hope of justice for Sarah Harper, who had spent 12 years believing that her son was dead while he was actually being held prisoner by the very people she had trusted to find him. The government officials responsible for Lucas's disappearance were now offering Reed a chance to join their conspiracy, to benefit from his silence while a mother continued to grieve for a son who was still alive. Reed's response was immediate and unequivocal. He deleted the message without responding and turned off his phone's location services, though he knew that someone with government resources could probably track him regardless of his privacy settings. The offer of federal employment and financial reward revealed how desperate his unknown contacts were becoming, suggesting that his investigation was threatening something more significant than the reputation of a few corrupt officials. Reed spent the remaining daylight hours documenting everything he had discovered, creating a comprehensive record that would allow others to continue his investigation if he couldn't. He photographed the tunnel access point and the underground holding area, recorded detailed descriptions of his findings, and compiled a timeline that connected Lucas Harper's disappearance to the broader pattern of government surveillance and intervention. As evening approached, Reed returned to his apartment to find evidence that his space had been searched during his absence. The intrusion was subtle, the work of professionals who understood how to examine personal property without leaving obvious signs of their presence. But Reed's prosecutorial paranoia had led him to establish markers that would reveal unauthorized access, and those markers confirmed that people with sophisticated skills had been through his belongings. What they hadn't found was the evidence Reed had hidden in his secure storage facility, though their search suggested they understood exactly what they were looking for. The conspiracy was closing in around him, but Reed still had the proof necessary to expose the truth about Lucas Harper's disappearance and the government officials who had orchestrated it. Reed's phone rang with a call from Elena Vasquez, her voice tight with urgency and fear. She had spent the day researching the officials shown in Reed's photographs and had uncovered information that made the conspiracy even more complex and dangerous than either of them had realized. The people responsible for Lucas Harper's disappearance weren't just corrupt cops or federal agents operating without authorization. They were part of a systematic program that had been using missing children cases to hide government operations that violated both domestic and international law. Vasquez had found evidence of similar cases dating back decades. Children who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, only to have their investigations suddenly terminated for national security reasons. The Lucas Harper case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that suggested ongoing criminal activity at the highest levels of government. But Vasquez's research had also attracted unwanted attention. She had received threats during the day, subtle warnings that her investigation was putting her in danger. Someone was watching her movements and monitoring her communications, probably the same people who had been surveilling Reed's investigation for 12 years. Reed realized that the deadline he had been given wasn't arbitrary. Someone was planning to resolve the situation permanently, probably within the next few hours. He had pushed the conspiracy as far as it would bend, and now it was preparing to push back with lethal force. Standing in his compromised apartment, holding evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government, Reed understood that he had reached the point of no return. The truth about Lucas Harper was finally within his grasp, but obtaining that truth would require him to risk everything he had built since that October evening, when his life had first intersected with forces beyond his comprehension. Reed's final evening as a free man began with a knock on his apartment door that he had been expecting for hours. The sound was polite, professional, the kind of measured announcement that law enforcement officers use when they want to avoid creating unnecessary drama. But Reed knew from 12 years of experience that politeness could be more dangerous than obvious threats, especially when it came from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to make inconvenient problems disappear permanently. Through his door's security camera, Reed recognized the face of Deputy District Attorney Michael Chen, a colleague who had worked closely with Reed on several high-profile cases over the past 3 years. Chen's presence was both reassuring and terrifying, confirmation that the conspiracy reached into Reed's own professional circles, but also suggesting that his visitors might be more interested in negotiation than elimination. Reed opened the door to find Chen accompanied by 2 other men who were obviously federal agents. Despite their attempt to dress like civilian consultants, the agents remained silent, while Chen spoke with the careful diction of someone who understood that every word might later be analyzed for legal implications. Chen explained that Reed's investigation had attracted attention from people who were in a position to either destroy his career or elevate it to heights he had never imagined possible. The choice was Reed's, but the decision had to be made immediately and permanently. There would be no second chances, no opportunities to reconsider once Reed had chosen his path forward. What Chen revealed during the next hour shattered every assumption Reed had made about the Lucas Harper case and forced him to confront the possibility that justice and truth were not always compatible concepts. The story Chen told was complex and morally ambiguous, the kind of operational necessity that government agencies preferred to keep classified, not because it was illegal, but because public understanding would make future similar operations impossible. Lucas Harper's father, Staff Sergeant David Harper, had been part of a classified military intelligence operation in Afghanistan that had uncovered evidence of systematic war crimes committed by private contractors working alongside American forces. The evidence included documentation of civilian massacres, torture facilities, and financial corruption that reached into the highest levels of both the military command structure and the private companies receiving government contracts. Sergeant Harper had been preparing to testify before a congressional oversight committee when his unit was attacked by what appeared to be enemy forces, but was actually a coordinated strike designed to eliminate witnesses to the contractor's activities. Harper survived the attack, but was severely wounded and transported to a military hospital in Germany, where he spent several months recovering from injuries that left him with permanent cognitive impairment. During his recovery, Harper had been visited by his wife and son, a reunion that the military had arranged to boost morale and demonstrate their commitment to supporting wounded veterans and their families. What the military hadn't anticipated was that Harper's brain injury had eliminated his ability to distinguish between classified and unclassified information, causing him to share details of his intelligence findings with his 7-year-old son during what should have been casual family conversations. Lucas Harper had returned to New York with his mother, carrying in his young mind detailed knowledge of war crimes that could destroy careers, topple governments, and fundamentally alter America's relationship with its military contractors. The boy didn't understand the significance of what his father had told him, but he had an exceptional memory and had begun repeating some of his father's stories to friends and teachers who recognized that a 7-year-old shouldn't know such specific details about military operations. Chen explained that the decision to remove Lucas Harper from his normal life hadn't been made lightly or quickly. Months of psychological evaluation and risk assessment had preceded the operation, with multiple government agencies analyzing the potential consequences of allowing the boy to remain in circumstances where his inadvertent revelations could compromise ongoing investigations and endanger active personnel. The operation itself had been designed to simulate a kidnapping, while actually transferring Lucas to a secure facility where he could receive specialized education and psychological support. The boy had been sedated during the transfer to minimize trauma and had awakened in what appeared to be a boarding school environment with other children who were participating in similar protective custody arrangements. Reed listened to Chen's explanation with growing horror, not because the story was implausible, but because it was entirely consistent with everything he had discovered during his investigation. The government had kidnapped a 7-year-old boy to protect classified information, had allowed his mother to believe he was dead for 12 years, and had manipulated the investigation to ensure that no one would ever discover the truth. But Chen's story contained one detail that Reed found impossible to accept. According to the official version of events, Lucas Harper was alive and well, living under a new identity, and receiving the kind of education and opportunities that his original circumstances would never have provided. The boy had been told that his parents had died in an accident and that his new life was the result of a charitable foundation's intervention on behalf of orphaned children. Reed demanded proof that Lucas was alive, evidence that the boy was actually benefiting from his forced relocation rather than suffering in some form of institutional imprisonment. Chen's response revealed the final layer of the conspiracy that had consumed Reed's professional life for over a decade. Chen produced a tablet computer and showed Reed recent photographs and video footage of a young man who bore a strong resemblance to how Lucas Harper might have appeared after 12 years of growth and development. The young man was attending what appeared to be an elite private university, participating in athletics and social activities that suggested a normal and healthy adjustment to his circumstances. But as Reed studied the images more carefully, he began to notice details that undermined Chen's narrative. The young man's eyes held a wariness that was inconsistent with the confident demeanor that his activities suggested. His smiles appeared forced, the practiced expressions of someone who had learned to perform happiness rather than experience it genuinely. Most telling were the discreet security measures visible in every photograph: bodyguards disguised as fellow students, surveillance equipment integrated into campus architecture, and controlled environments that suggested ongoing imprisonment despite the appearance of freedom. Reed realized that Lucas Harper was alive, but living as a prisoner whose cooperation had been purchased through years of psychological manipulation and the elimination of any alternative to compliance. The boy had been transformed into a young man who believed that his current circumstances represented salvation rather than captivity. a masterpiece of institutional control that had turned kidnapping into apparent rescue. Chen's presentation concluded with an offer that revealed why Reed had been allowed to discover the truth about Lucas Harper's fate. The government agencies responsible for the operation were facing congressional oversight that could expose their activities to public scrutiny. They needed someone with Reed's reputation for integrity and legal expertise to provide testimony that would justify their actions as necessary responses to legitimate national security threats. Reed would be appointed to a federal prosecutor position with a salary that would triple his current income and access to classified information that would make him one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. In exchange, he would testify that his investigation had confirmed the necessity of the operation and that Lucas Harper's relocation had been conducted according to appropriate legal procedures. The alternative, Chen explained with careful neutrality, was that Reed's investigation would be terminated, along with his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life. The same people who had orchestrated Lucas Harper's disappearance had the resources and motivation to ensure that Reed's discoveries would never become public knowledge. Reed asked for time to consider the offer, knowing that his answer was already determined, but needing space to process the implications of what he had learned. Chen agreed to a delay of several hours, but emphasized that the decision was final and binding once made. Reed would either join the conspiracy or become its next victim, with no middle ground available for someone who had learned too much to be allowed to walk away freely. After Chen and his companions left, Reed spent the early morning hours creating a comprehensive record of everything he had discovered about the Lucas Harper case. His account included not only the evidence he had gathered, but also Chen's revelations about the government operation that had transformed a missing child case into a mechanism for protecting classified information through institutional kidnapping. Reed uploaded his documentation to multiple secure servers and established automated systems that would release the information to journalists, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations if he failed to prevent the release through regular check-ins. The dead man's switch would ensure that the truth about Lucas Harper would eventually become public knowledge, regardless of what happened to Reed personally. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Reed made his final visit to Central Park, walking once more through the locations where Lucas Harper had spent his last day of freedom. The park was empty, except for early morning joggers and maintenance crews, the peaceful atmosphere providing a stark contrast to the violent conspiracy that had used this public space as the setting for a child's disappearance. Reed stood at the spot where Lucas's footprints had mysteriously ended 12 years earlier, now understanding that the boy had been carried into the tunnel system by professionals who had planned every detail of the operation. The mystery that had consumed Reed's career had been solved, but the solution revealed a level of institutional corruption that made traditional concepts of justice seem inadequate to address the crimes that had been committed. Reed's phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Vasquez, informing him that her investigation had been terminated by federal agents who had confiscated her research materials and threatened her with prosecution if she continued pursuing the story. The conspiracy was closing ranks, eliminating threats and securing evidence that could expose their activities to public scrutiny. Reed realized that his time was running out, that Chen's offer represented the final opportunity to resolve the situation through negotiation rather than force. The government officials responsible for Lucas Harper's disappearance were prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation, but they preferred to convert threats into assets when possible. Reed's decision was ultimately determined not by fear for his own safety, but by recognition that Lucas Harper deserved justice, even if that justice came at a price that Reed couldn't survive paying. A 7-year-old boy had been stolen from his family and transformed into a prisoner whose captivity was disguised as privilege. The boy's mother had spent 12 years grieving for a son who was still alive, denied even the comfort of knowing that her child had survived whatever had taken him from her. Reed called Chen and provided his answer, with the calm certainty of someone who had finally understood his purpose. He would not join the conspiracy, would not provide testimony that justified the unjustifiable, and would not allow his reputation for integrity to be used as cover for institutional criminality that violated every principle of justice he had spent his career defending. Chen's response was immediate and final. Reed's apartment would be searched that evening by federal agents who would discover evidence that he had been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services. His arrest would be followed by a trial that would destroy his reputation and result in a prison sentence that would effectively end his life. The Lucas Harper case would remain classified indefinitely, and anyone who attempted to investigate it would face similar consequences. Reed spent his final hours of freedom ensuring that his documentation of the conspiracy was secure and would be released regardless of what happened to him personally. He also composed letters to Sarah Harper and to Lucas Harper himself, though he knew that neither letter would ever be delivered by the people who controlled their lives. To Sarah, Reed wrote that her son was alive but beyond her reach, living under circumstances that amounted to sophisticated imprisonment disguised as educational opportunity. Lucas had been transformed into someone who no longer remembered his original family, but he retained the essential character that had made him such a remarkable child. To Lucas, Reed wrote an explanation of his true history and identity, though he knew the young man might never be allowed to read it. Reed wanted Lucas to understand that his original family had loved him deeply and had never stopped looking for him, even when all hope seemed lost. As evening approached, Reed heard vehicles arriving outside his apartment building and recognized the careful coordination that preceded federal arrests. He had known this moment would come since making his decision to pursue justice rather than self-preservation, and he felt a sense of peace that came from finally understanding his role in a story that had been unfolding since that October evening when a little boy had vanished from Central Park. Reed opened his apartment door before the federal agents could knock, surrendering himself to a justice system that he had served faithfully for decades, but which was now being used as a weapon against him. The charges would be fabricated, the evidence would be planted, and the trial would be a performance designed to destroy his credibility and serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to investigate cases that powerful people preferred to keep closed. But Reed's defeat was also his victory, because the truth about Lucas Harper would survive, even if Reed himself did not. The automated systems he had established would eventually release his documentation to people who understood the significance of what he had discovered, and the conspiracy that had controlled Lucas Harper's fate for 12 years would finally face the scrutiny it had worked so hard to avoid. The last thing Reed saw before being placed in handcuffs was the symbol that had been carved into the evidence bag, now etched into the surface of a federal vehicle parked outside his building. The mark that he had thought was mysterious was actually a signature, the calling card of an organization that operated beyond traditional legal boundaries and answered to authorities that Reed had never imagined existed. Lucas Harper's story would continue long after Reed's own story ended, but the boy would never be truly free until the truth about his disappearance became public knowledge, and the people responsible for his captivity were held accountable for their crimes. Reed had done everything in his power to ensure that day would eventually come, even if he wouldn't be alive to see justice finally served.